May 1945, an Allied intelligence facility in southern Germany. Field Marshal Ger von Rundstedt, the most senior German commander on the Western Front, the man who had overseen the defense of Fortress Europe from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, is sitting across a table from American officers. He has been a prisoner for less than a week. He is 69 years old. He is tired, and he is being asked a question that in one form or another every captured German general will be asked over the next several months. The question is simple. Why did Germany lose in the West? Rundstedt gives 3 reasons. First, the absolute superiority of Allied air power which made all movement in daylight impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel which paralyzed the Panzers and grounded the Luftwaffe. Third, the systematic destruction of the railway network which made it impossible to bring a single train across the Rhine. 3 clean military answers from a professional soldier. Air, fuel, rail. That is his verdict. He does not mention a 4th factor. He does not mention the trucks. Not the trucks that carried ammunition. Not the trucks that carried fuel or food or medical supplies. He does not mention the other trucks. The ones that carried Doughnut machines. The ones that carried photograph records and coffee urns and copies of a daily newspaper written by soldiers for soldiers. The ones that were driven by women, college-educated women from Connecticut and Indiana and Virginia, who had volunteered to follow the United States Army across Europe for the purpose of handing a 19-year-old rifleman a hot donut and asking him where he was from. Rundstedt did not mention those trucks because he could not see them. They were invisible to him, not because they were hidden, but because they existed in a category that his entire military education had no name for. The Wehrmacht had a word for firepower. It had a word for maneuver. It had a word for supply. It did not have a word for what the Americans were doing when they sent a 2 and 1/2 ton GMC truck full of pastries and popular music to a crossroads 3 miles behind the fighting, staffed it with 3 young women who knew how to crack a joke and pour coffee in a snowstorm, and let it sit there while exhausted infantrymen lined up in the mud for something that had nothing to do with winning a battle and everything to do with winning a war. This is the story of those trucks. It is the story of the women who drove them. It is the story of a country that understood something about soldiers that the most powerful military machine in Europe never learned. And it begins not in the Second World War, but in the first one, in a flooded tent on the Western Front in October 1917, where a woman from Huntington, Indiana, dropped to her knees on a dirt floor and fried 7 doughnuts in a small pan over an open flame and accidentally created a tradition that would follow the American soldier for the next 30 years and across 2 oceans. Before we go back to that tent, I need you to understand what this story is actually about. It is not about donuts. A donut is flour, sugar, lard, and baking powder. You can make one in 4 minutes. It has no military value. It does not stop a bullet. It does not move a division. It does not win a battle. And yet, the United States of America, in the middle of the deadliest conflict in human history, built an industrial system capable of producing hundreds of doughnuts per minute and delivering them to soldiers close enough to the front lines that the women doing the delivering sometimes had to camouflage their trucks with netting to avoid being spotted by German aircraft. The question is why? Why would a country fighting for its survival invest fuel, vehicles, shipping tonnage, and human lives into getting a fried pastry into the hands of a private in a foxhole? The German military had no answer to that question, and they never found one. Not during the war and not after it. In their post-war memoirs, German generals wrote tens of thousands of pages about American air power, American armor, American industrial production, and American logistics. Almost none of them wrote a single paragraph about the system that kept the American soldier believing that the country behind him actually cared whether he lived or died. That system, the donut trucks and the coffee urns and the USO shows and the daily newspapers and the portable Coca-Cola bottling plants that followed the army across continents was not a luxury. It was a weapon. The Germans never recognized it as one. And that failure of recognition is part of why they lost. The woman on her knees in the tent was Ensign Helen Purvance of the Salvation Army. She was 28 years old, born on February 16, 1889 in Huntington, Indiana. She had come to France as one of 4 Salvation Army volunteers assigned to the camp of the 1st Ammunition Train, 1st Division, United States Army, near the Western Front. Her partner in that small waterlogged tent was Ensign Margaret Sheldon. The two of them had been sent to do whatever they could for the soldiers stationed at Montier-Sulx, a village in eastern France that in October 1917 was enduring a stretch of 36 consecutive days of rain. The mud was knee-deep, the men were exhausted, cold, and a long way from home. Purviance and Sheldon had been making pies and fudge with whatever they could scourge, but the supplies were thin, and the demand was enormous. Someone, and the historical record does not agree on exactly who, suggested doughnuts. The ingredients were available in the standard American military ration: flour, sugar, lard, baking powder. The equipment was not. Purviance improvised. She used a wine bottle as a rolling pin. She cut the dough with the lid of a baking powder tin. When she could not find a proper cutter for the center hole, she and Sheldon used a spent shell casing. The frying pan was small enough that she could only cook 7 doughnuts at a time. Purviance later described the moment plainly. She said, "I was literally on my knees when those first doughnuts were fried, 7 at a time." In a small fry pan, the first doughnut out of that pan was given to a soldier named Private Braxton Zuber of Alabama. Zuba reportedly took one bite and said, "If this is war, let it continue." On the first day, Purviance and Sheldon made 150 doughnuts. The next day, they made 300. Within weeks, as word spread through the division, and then through the Corps, and then through the entire American Expeditionary Force, production at various Salvation Army stations climbed to 2,500 and then to 9,000 doughnuts per day, per unit. Some of them were fried in steel helmets over open fires. Some were made in abandoned farmhouse kitchens. The tools were always improvised. The demand was always greater than the supply. A young Salvation Army volunteer named Stella Young, just 20 years old, later recounted to the Boston Daily Globe that she was stationed near the Met's front when a German shell landed close enough to send shrapnel tearing through her tent and through a donut pan. She had stepped away moments before. She went back to frying. Fewer than 250 Salvation Army volunteers served in France during the First World War. Most of them were women. They were not nurses. They were not officers. They had no formal military role. They had come to France to do one thing: to remind American soldiers that someone from home gave a damn. The soldiers called them the Doughnut Lassies. The name stuck, and so did the association. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who served in France as an officer, wrote afterward, "Before the war, I felt that the Salvation Army was composed of a well-meaning lot of cranks. Now what help I can give them is theirs." What the Salvation Army women had discovered without any formal study or doctrine behind it was something that military thinkers would spend the next century trying to articulate. The donut was not nutrition. A fighting man could get calories from his ration tin. The donut was a transaction. It was an exchange between the soldier and the country he was fighting for, conducted through the hands of a woman who had volunteered to stand in a war zone for the specific purpose of making him feel like a person instead of a serial number. It was in a way that nobody involved could have explained at the time an act of national intimacy. The country reached out through that donut and said, "I see you. I know you are cold and frightened and far from home. Here is something warm." The effect on morale was so disproportionate to the cost that it baffled the military professionals who observed it. A donut cost almost nothing to produce. The goodwill it generated was incalculable. When the war ended, the soldiers came home, and they remembered. They remembered the mud and the shells and the gas, and they remembered the doughnuts. In 1938, the Salvation Army established National Doughnut Day, the first Friday of every June in Chicago, to honor the women who had served in France. It was a small commemoration of a small thing. Nobody at the time imagined that within 3 years the small thing would be scaled up into one of the most extraordinary morale operations any army had ever attempted. But between the wars something else had happened that would make the scaling up possible. The United States had become, without quite intending it, the most logistics-capable nation on Earth. The country that Henry Ford had taught to build automobiles on an assembly line. The country that had electrified its cities and connected them with highways and railroads and telephone wires. The country that had figured out how to mass-produce everything from canned soup to motion pictures. That was about to bring that same industrial mentality to the problem of keeping a soldier's spirits up in a foxhole 10,000 miles from home. When the American Red Cross decided to build the Club Mobile system, it was not starting from nothing. It was drawing on a national culture of standardization, mass production, and logistical efficiency that had no parallel anywhere else in the world. The Germans could build better tanks. The Americans could build a system that delivered a hot donut to the man standing next to the tank, and they could do it at a scale that made the delivery look easy, even though it was anything but. When the United States entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the American Red Cross was given primary responsibility for providing welfare and recreation services to the armed forces overseas. The man who shaped what that responsibility would look like in the European theater was Harvey D. Gibson, a prominent New York banker who had served as a lieutenant colonel with the American Red Cross in France during the First World War and was now the American Red Cross Commissioner to Great Britain. Gibson had watched what the Salvation Army had done in the First War with almost no resources. He asked the obvious question, what would happen if you took the same idea, the idea that a hot donut and a familiar face could hold a soldier together when nothing else could, and industrialized it? The answer was the Club Mobile. The first ones were converted London Green Line single-decker buses retrofitted with Doughnut machines, coffee urns, a small lounge area, a Victrola phonograph, loudspeakers, and a collection of popular records. They were designed to drive to wherever American troops were stationed in Britain Park and serve. When the invasion of Europe began, the buses were replaced by something that could actually follow an army across a continent. The Red Cross converted approximately 100 GMC 2.5-ton military trucks, the same trucks that carried ammunition and fuel and everything else the American Army needed to fight, into mobile recreation centers. Each truck had a donut machine built into it. A Primus stove, a coffee urn, stacks of magazines, a phonograph, and a small space in the back where a soldier could sit down out of the rain for 10 minutes and talk to someone who was not trying to kill him. The Doughnut Corporation of America loaned the Red Cross 468 Doughnut machines. Each machine could produce 48 dozen donuts per hour. Do the arithmetic, that is 576 donuts per machine per hour. Multiply that across 468 machines running in shifts across the European and Pacific theaters day after day, month after month for years, and you begin to understand the scale of what the Americans built. Between 1939 and 1946, the American Red Cross purchased enough flour to produce 1.6 billion donuts. At peak production in 1944 and 45, the system was turning out 400 donuts per minute. A single monthly report for December 1944 recorded that 205 Red Cross women stationed in Great Britain alone served 4,659,728 donuts in 31 days. The machines could not run themselves. The trucks could not drive themselves. The system required people, and the Red Cross was not going to send just anyone. The women who staffed the Club Mobiles, who would come to be called the Doughnut Dollies, were selected through a process more demanding than standard military recruitment. Applicants had to be between 25 and 35 years old. They had to be college graduates. They had to be single. They had to be, in the Red Cross's own language, healthy, physically hardy, sociable, and attractive. Only 1 in 6 applicants was accepted. That is a higher rejection rate than many combat units. The women who made it through were sent to American University in Washington, D.C. for training. They received multiple immunizations. They were fitted for uniforms and issued 10 pages of uniform regulations that specified, among other things, no earrings, no brilliant nail polish, and no excessive use of cosmetics. They were trained in vehicle maintenance because they would be driving and repairing their own trucks. They were trained in how to talk to soldiers, which sounds like a strange skill to teach until you understand that these women were going to be standing in front of hundreds of young men every day, many of whom had not spoken to an American woman in months, some of whom had just come off the line and were not entirely sure they were still alive. The job required a specific kind of emotional endurance that the Red Cross understood, even if nobody had a clinical name for it yet. The daily routine of a Club Mobile crew was physically punishing. 3 women to a truck. They woke before dawn, mixed Doughnut batter, heated the oil, and began frying while the truck was still being driven to its assigned location. They served for hours at a stretch, standing at the side of the truck in rain or snow or heat, pouring coffee, handing out donuts, making small talk with an unbroken line of soldiers, many of whom had just rotated off the line, and some of whom would be going back on it within hours. The women were expected to be cheerful. They were expected to remember names. They were expected to make eye contact and say something specific and human and real to every man who stepped up to the window. Not because a regulation required it, but because that eye contact, that moment of individual recognition, was the entire point of the operation. A soldier could get food from a mess truck. What he could not get from a mess truck was the feeling that someone from home had come all the way to a war to see him. The Red Cross operation in Britain alone was staggering in its scale. The Rainbow Corner Club in London, one of the most famous rest facilities of the war, served as many as 60,000 meals in a single 24-hour period. That is not a misprint. 60,000 meals in one day in one building for American servicemen on leave in the capital of an allied nation that was itself rationing food. The club had a dance floor, a barber shop, a tailor, a photographer, a mailroom, and a cafeteria. It was open around the clock. When American soldiers came in from the cold and the rain of an English winter, they walked into a building that felt like a bus station in Cleveland or a diner in Philadelphia. That was intentional. Every detail was designed to reproduce as closely as possible the texture of American civilian life in a country that was 5,000 miles from home. But the club mobiles were only one piece of what the American military built. The morale infrastructure that followed the United States Army across Europe and the Pacific was so vast, so logistically demanding, and so thoroughly integrated into the way America fought that it deserves to be described in full, because nothing like it had ever existed before, and the Germans had no equivalent for any of it. On June 29, 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in North Africa sent a cable to the War Department requesting equipment for 10 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants, 3 million filled bottles, and enough supplies to produce that quantity twice a month. Coca-Cola. President Robert Woodruff had already promised in 1941 to see that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. The 10 plants that Eisenhower requested eventually became 64 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants deployed across every theater of the war. Operated by 148 civilian technical observers in Army fatigues who had officer rank and pay. The soldiers called them the Coca-Cola Colonels. By the end of the war, more than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola had been consumed by American military personnel. The Army's daily newspaper, Stars and Stripes, was revived in London in April 1942. By January 1945, it was being printed simultaneously at as many as 25 locations and had a daily circulation exceeding 1.2 million copies. It was editorially independent. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally championed and protected that independence, insisting that no official control would be exercised over the material that went into Stars and Stripes. The result was a newspaper that published Bill Molden's Willie and Joe cartoons, which regularly mocked officers and Army bureaucracy alongside war news and baseball scores. General George S. Patton wrote furious letters to the paper. The paper published them. The United Service Organizations, the USO, was putting on roughly 700 shows per day by the time Germany surrendered. By the war's end, approximately 7,300 entertainers had performed in 420,000 shows across every theater, playing to a combined audience of 130 million service member attendances. Bob Hope and his troupe traveled more than 80,000 miles during the war, performing in hospitals, on airfields, on the decks of ships, and sometimes close enough to the front that they could hear the guns. Behind all of this was a doctrine, even if nobody called it that at the time. George C. Marshall articulated it at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut on June 15, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He said, "It is not enough to fight. It is the spirit which we bring to the fight that decides the issue. It is morale that wins the victory." Eisenhower would later write in his memoir Crusade in Europe that morale is the greatest single factor in successful war. These were not throwaway lines. Marshall meant them as strategic principles. He believed that an army that felt cared for would fight harder, hold longer, and recover faster than one that did not. He built the systems to back that belief. At its wartime peak in 1945, the American Red Cross had 7.5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff. It operated nearly 2,000 recreation facilities abroad, staffed by approximately 5,000 paid workers. It received $784 million in contributions during the war years and operated 3,757 chapters across the country. It was by any measure one of the largest volunteer mobilizations in human history, and its purpose was not to fight the war, but to sustain the people who were fighting it. In the weeks after D-Day, 10 Club Mobile groups, each consisting of 8 trucks, crossed the English Channel and landed on the Normandy beaches. Approximately 320 women in the initial wave drove their own trucks off the landing craft, through the wreckage of the invasion, and into a country that was still being fought over field by field. They drove through the Boage country where American infantry was dying at a rate worse per yard than anything in the First World War. They set up at crossroads and field hospitals and ammunition depots, wherever they could find a concentration of soldiers and a flat place to park, and they started making doughnuts. The trucks were camouflaged with moss green netting to avoid being spotted by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. The women learned to identify the sound of incoming artillery and to distinguish between outgoing and incoming fire, a skill that took most infantry replacements about a week to develop and that the Red Cross training course at American University had not covered. Some of the Club Mobiles were configured as cinemobiles carrying movie projectors, portable stages, and even pianos. Others carried nothing but Doughnut machines and coffee. All of them carried the thing that no machine could produce, which was the presence of an American woman who knew the right slang, knew how to talk about baseball and Glenn Miller and apple pie, and who could look a 20-year-old soldier in the eye and make him feel for 5 minutes like he was back in the world he had left behind. Some of the women had to go on foot when the roads were impossible, carrying donuts and coffee to soldiers through terrain that the trucks could not navigate. Others helped load aircraft with donuts in the Mediterranean, getting supplies to men stationed on islands and airfields that the Club Mobile trucks could never reach. In September 1944, in a village in liberated France, a photographer named Margaret Kays documented a moment that captures the reach of the Club Mobile's influence. French children, many of whom had been living under German occupation for 4 years, were sampling their first American donuts at a Club Mobile stop. The truck had been sent for the soldiers, but the children had gathered around it the way children gather around anything new, and the women had done what anyone from home would have done. They fed the children, too. One of those women was Jill Pitts-Knappenberger. She was assigned to the 8th Corps with the Club Mobile Cheyenne alongside her crew mates Phyllis McLolan and Helen Anderson. Knappenberger's war took her from the siege of Brest in Brittany to the Battle of the Bulge to the crossing of the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. She earned a European Theater of Operations ribbon with 5 battle stars, which is more than many infantrymen received. Her twin brother, Captain John Joseph Pitts III, commanded Battery A, 590th Field Artillery Battalion, 106th Infantry Division near St. Vith in the Ardennes. On approximately December 13, 1944, just 2 days before the German offensive began, Knappenberger traveled from her station to her brother's battalion headquarters near Schönberg, Germany, east of St. V. The twins saw each other for the last time. On December 16th, the first day of the German attack, the 106th Division was torn apart. Captain Pitts was killed that afternoon. His sister learned of his death while serving donuts behind the lines that were now on fire. Phyllis McLolan, Knappenberger's crew mate on the Cheyenne, kept a diary through the entire war. She wrote about the cold and the mud and the fatigue, and she wrote about the soldiers. She wrote about the faces of young men who had been in combat for weeks and who lit up when the Club Mobile appeared, not because of the donuts, but because the truck meant that the world behind them still existed. McLachlan's group went from Normandy to the Bavarian Alps, through the liberation of Paris to the Battle of the Bulge, to the liberation of Buchenwald. She saw the concentration camp. She saw what the war had actually been about. She carried those memories quietly for the rest of her life. Her son, the novelist Luis Alberto Urrea, eventually drew on her diaries for a novel published in 2023 called Good Night Irene, which brought the story of the Club Mobile women to a readership that had never heard of them. Another was Elizabeth and Richardson of Mishawaka, Indiana. Liz, as everyone called her, was a 1940 graduate of Milwaukee Downer College. She served on Club Mobiles in England and France, and was promoted to captain in charge of Club Mobile operations at Le Havre, one of the great American supply ports on the French coast. In a letter to her parents in September 1944, she wrote, I consider myself fortunate to be in Club Mobile. Cannot conceive of anything else. It is a rugged and irregular and weird life, but it is wonderful. To a college friend, she wrote something that captures the spirit of the entire Club Mobile service in a single sentence. She said, "Damn glad I have a degree. It helps so much in making donuts." On the morning of July 25, 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender, Liz Richardson boarded a Piper Cub light aircraft in Lille to fly to Paris for orders reassigning her to Germany. Near Rouen, the plane flew into heavy fog and crashed. Liz Richardson was killed. She was 27 years old. The pilot, Sergeant William R. Miller of the 9th Air Force, also died. Liz Richardson is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, Plot A, Row 21, Grave 5. She is one of only 4 women buried there. Among the thousands of soldiers who died taking the beaches, she had spent a year serving donuts behind. Dorothy J. Burge was a school teacher who joined the Red Cross and went overseas in September 1943. She and her sister Grace operated a Club Mobile together, driving from England through Normandy, across France, through Belgium, and into Germany. The Burge sisters served side by side through some of the worst fighting of the war. They were teachers. They had spent their professional lives in classrooms with children. Now they were driving a 2.5-ton truck through a destroyed landscape, making donuts for young men who were younger than some of their former students, and who were facing things that no classroom could prepare anyone for. On May 1, 1945, 8 days before the formal German surrender, Dorothy Burge was killed in a plane crash in Germany. She was 29 years old. She had survived the entire war. She did not survive the peace. Her sister Grace carried that loss for the rest of her life. If your grandmother or great-aunt served with the Red Cross during the Second World War, in any theater, in any capacity, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit were they assigned to? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. 86 American Red Cross workers lost their lives during the Second World War. 52 of them were women. 34 were men. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They had no military obligation to be where they were. They went because they believed that the men doing the fighting deserved someone to remind them of home. And some of them died for that belief. On December 5, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton issued a statement about the Club Mobile women that was circulated to every crew in the 3rd Army's area of operations. He said, "In my opinion, the Club Mobile girls of the American Red Cross have performed and are performing a very major work in maintaining the morale of the frontline troops and in keeping before the eyes of our soldiers the best traditions of apparent American womanhood. The 3rd Army joins me in a respectful and enthusiastic endorsement of the American Red Cross." Patton was not a man given to sentiment. He once slapped a soldier for crying in a field hospital. When he praised the Club Mobile women, he was not being polite. He was acknowledging a tactical reality. His soldiers fought better after the truck came. There is a small moment that one of the Club Mobile women, Ella Lenina Stevenson, described after the war that says more than any statistic. She said the standard routine when a Club Mobile pulled up to a convoy was simple. We would yell out to a truckload of GIS, "Hi, soldier. What is cooking?" And the guys would yell back, "Chicken, want a neck?" It was silly. It was juvenile. It was exactly the kind of exchange that a 20-year-old American male would have had with a young woman in a diner in Ohio or a drugstore in Virginia. That was the point. For 30 seconds, the war was not real. For 30 seconds, the kid in the back of the truck was not a soldier heading toward a line where 1 in 4 of his platoon would be dead within a month. He was just a guy making a bad joke at a pretty girl. And then the truck rolled on, and the war came back. But something had been deposited in him that was not there before the truck stopped. The Germans had a word for what they were trying to produce in their own soldiers. They called it Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. They tried to produce it through ideology, through speeches, through the cult of the Führer, through the promise of a 1,000-year Reich. The Americans produced it with a donut and a wisecrack. The American version lasted longer. To understand why the German military never built anything like the Club Mobile system, you have to understand what they built instead. The Wehrmacht was not indifferent to morale. It had its own welfare infrastructure organized under the term Truppenbetreuung, which translates roughly as troop care. The system was administered through the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the Reich Chamber of Culture, and the Nazi Party's leisure organization, Kraft der Freude, which means strength through joy. Kraft der Freude ran front theater troops, front theater groups that performed plays and variety shows for soldiers behind the lines. It operated soldier cinemas and soldier homes. The Soldatenheim, which were rest facilities where men could sleep in a bed, take a bath, and eat a meal that was not field rations. It ran frontline book vans, the Front Band Lungen, which distributed reading material, and it operated the Wehrmacht Forces radio network, the Wehrmacht Sender, which included the famous grade station that broadcast Lili Marleen, the song that became the unofficial anthem of every soldier on every side of the war. Some of this was genuinely effective. Lili Marleen was so popular with Allied troops that the BBC eventually broadcast its own version. The field kitchens, the goulash cannon or goulash cannons as the soldiers called them, were efficient and in the early years of the war delivered hot meals surprisingly close to the front with rations averaging 3,600 calories per day and field rations reaching as high as 4,500 calories. But the system was philosophically different from the American, one in three ways that mattered. First, it was state propaganda. Every piece of entertainment, every newspaper, every film shown in a Soldatenheim was controlled by the propaganda ministry. There was no stars and stripes, no editorially independent newspaper where a cartoonist could mock the commanding general and keep his job. There was no free press in the foxhole. Second, it was built on the assumption of conquest. The Wehrmacht's logistics, including its food supply, were designed around the idea that the army would live off the land in conquered territory. This worked in France. It worked for a time in the Soviet Union. It meant that when the land could no longer be lived off, when the army was pushed back onto German soil or into places where there was nothing left to take, the entire system began to collapse. Third, and most importantly, there was no equivalent of the Doughnut dolly. There was no system that sent women from home to the front with no purpose other than to remind soldiers of the country they had left behind. The German soldiers' contact with home was the Feldpost, the military mail system, and whatever Kraft Dutch Frieder programming reached his sector. He did not have a woman from his own country hand him a donut and ask him about his hometown. The German military, which prided itself on understanding the psychology of combat, never built the one thing that the American system proved was more effective than ideology at sustaining a soldier's will to fight. They never built a connection to home that felt personal rather than political. The daily reality of a German frontline soldier in the last 2 years of the war was a study in declining standards that the Wehrmacht's leadership was unable to arrest. The bread ration, which had been a source of quiet pride in the German army for its reliability, began to include increasing quantities of filler. Margarine replaced butter. Artificial honey replaced sugar. Ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns replaced the real thing. Cigarettes, often manufactured in Spain specifically for Wehrmacht distribution, were tightly rationed and frequently unavailable. Chocolate was a luxury reserved for special rations. There was no ice cream. There was no Coca-Cola. There were no portable bottling plants following the army. There was in the late stages of the war often nothing except what the soldiers could scavenge from the land they were retreating through or the supplies they could capture from the enemy. Compare that to what an American soldier in the same theater had access to in the same month. He received a daily ration of approximately 3,500 calories. He had near universal access to chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes. He could drink Coca-Cola bottled in a portable plant somewhere in France. He could get hot donuts and coffee from a Club Mobile. He could read that morning's Stars and Stripes. He could on occasion see a USO show performed in a barn or a field within the sound of the guns. He could write home on stationery provided by the Red Cross and know that the letter would be carried by a mail system that functioned with remarkable efficiency even in combat conditions. And if he was wounded, he would be treated in a hospital system that, while imperfect, was the most advanced and best supplied in any army in the world. The disparity was so extreme that when German prisoners of war reached American camps in the United States, many of them ate better than they had eaten in the Wehrmacht. They were served the same rations as American soldiers in the mess hall. The food was abundant and varied. The contrast with what they had endured on the front line was so stark that it became, in an ugly irony, a source of acute domestic controversy. At camps across the American South, German prisoners of war and white American soldiers ate at the same tables, while black American soldiers who served as guards were segregated to separate facilities. At one camp in Texas, German prisoners used the same latrines as white Americans, while black soldiers were directed to separate ones. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black American soldier, wrote a letter to the military magazine Yank in April 1944, describing how he and other black soldiers had to eat in the kitchen of a lunchroom while German prisoners were served at the counter. The American morale system, for all its ingenuity, contained contradictions that would take another generation to begin to resolve. By 1944, even the systems the Wehrmacht did have were disintegrating. Civilian rations in Germany had fallen from roughly 278 calories per day in the winter of 1942 to 43 to 1980 calories the following year to 1670 calories by 1944 to 45. They were dropped to 1412 calories in the final year. Frontline military rations held up longer, but they were maintained only by stripping food from occupied territories. The daily calorie allocation for civilians in occupied Poland by the end of 1943 was 855 calories. For Soviet prisoners of war, it was functionally zero. More than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, primarily from starvation, exposure, and disease. When the Wehrmacht launched its final major offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the operation was premised on a confession of total logistical failure. The German plan required capturing American fuel dumps to keep the panzers moving. The offensive could not sustain itself on German supplies alone. On December 17, 1944, the spearhead of the attack, Camp Grouper Piper, under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, overran an American fuel depot at Bullingen, Belgium, and seized approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline. Piper's troops forced American prisoners of war to refuel the German tanks. It was the kind of scene that would have been unimaginable in 1940 when the Wehrmacht's logistics were the envy of every army in Europe. By 1944, the most elite armored unit in the German military could not advance without stealing fuel from the enemy, and even the stolen fuel was not enough. Piper's advance stalled within days because there was no more American gasoline to take. The contrast with what the American soldier had access to in December 1944 was not subtle. While Piper's men were siphoning American fuel at gunpoint, American soldiers in the same theater were receiving hot donuts from Club Mobile trucks, reading that morning's Stars and Stripes, drinking Coca-Cola bottled in a portable plant somewhere in France, and in some cases watching a USO show that had been organized in a barn behind the lines 3 days after the German attack began. The American system did not stop during the Battle of the Bulge. It kept running. The Club Mobiles kept serving. Jill Pitts, Knappenberger, and the crew of the Cheyenne were in the Ardennes that December. They did not leave. Think about what that means for a moment. The most dangerous German offensive since 1940. The attack that would produce more than 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. The battle that came closer than any other engagement on the Western Front to breaking the American line. And the Doughnut trucks stayed. They stayed because the women driving them understood something that Piper, with all his tactical brilliance, did not. They understood that the soldiers who were going to stop the German offensive needed more than ammunition. They needed to know that someone behind them was still thinking of them as human beings. The truck at the crossroads was not a luxury. It was a lifeline, not for the body, but for the thing inside the body that makes a man stand up when every instinct is telling him to stay down. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers sat down with captured German commanders and asked them what had gone wrong, the answers they received were remarkably consistent and remarkably incomplete. Rundstedt gave his 3 factors: air superiority, fuel, railways. General Otto von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, said that Allied air forces found worthwhile targets throughout the whole area of the offensive and that bomb carpets laid on roads and railways throttled the already inadequate German supply system. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin in his 1956 memoir Panzer Battles wrote that the Ardennes battle proved that a large-scale offensive by massed armor has no hope of success against an enemy who enjoys supreme command of the air. General Adjutant Fritz Bioline, commanding the Panzer Division, described what Operation Cobra looked like from the receiving end near Saint-Lô on July 25, 1944. He said it was hell. The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt, and the bomb carpets came down. My front lines looked like a landscape of the moon, and at least 70% of personnel were out of action. Field Marshal Erwin RML, writing in June 1944, said simply, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There is simply no answer to it. Air, fuel, bombs, railways, armor. These are the words that fill the post-war German accounts. What is missing is everything that cannot be seen from 15,000 feet or through a pair of binoculars. What is missing is the Doughnut truck parked at the crossroads. What is missing is the Coca-Cola colonel refilling a bottling plant in a French village. What is missing is the copy of Stars and Stripes being read in a foxhole by a private who had not heard from his family in 3 weeks, but who could at least read yesterday's baseball scores and know that the world he was fighting for still existed somewhere behind him." In a converted manor house in North London called Trent Park, British military intelligence, specifically MI-19 under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Joseph Kendrick, had been recording something the German generals did not know about. Between 1942 and 1945, 84 captured German generals and hundreds of staff officers were housed in comfort at Trent Park, given chess sets and books and the run of the gardens, and encouraged to talk freely with each other. They were told nothing about the microphones hidden in every room, including the bedrooms and the lavatories. A fake aristocrat they knew as Lord Abfeldy. In reality, an intelligence officer named Ian Munro hosted them and kept the conversation flowing. British intelligence officers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Reich, sat in a basement transcribing more than 64,000 conversations. The transcripts, which run to roughly 100,000 pages, were eventually deposited in the National Archives in London and partially published by historian Sony Nittel in Tapping Hitler's Generals in 2007 and with Harold Welzer in Sarton in 2012. The Trent Park conversations are among the most valuable documents of the war because they capture what German officers actually thought rather than what they later chose to write in their memoirs. In those rooms, when the generals believed no one was listening, they spoke with a candor that their published accounts would never match. They talked about war crimes they had witnessed or ordered. They talked about the July 1944 bomb plot against Hitler. They talked about the technical failures of German weapons and the strategic failures of German planning. And they returned again and again to the question of why an army that had conquered France in 6 weeks and pushed to the gates of Moscow in 5 months was being driven back across its own borders by an opponent that every German officer in 1940 had dismissed as militarily insignificant. The published transcripts focus primarily on war crimes, the July 1944 plot against Hitler, and questions of ideology and technology. The specific subject of American morale infrastructure, the club mobiles, the Coca-Cola plants, the USO shows, does not feature prominently in the published extracts. But the underlying theme that runs through every conversation where the generals discuss why they lost is the theme of material abundance. They could not get past it. They circled it the way a man circles a bruise. They had been told all through the 1930s that Germany's enemies were soft, decadent, and incapable of sustained sacrifice. What they had encountered was an enemy that was soft in ways that turned out to be a form of strength. An enemy that insisted on comforts the VE considered unnecessary, and that turned out to be the difference between an army that held together and one that fell apart. There is a famous line that has circulated widely online and in documentary films in which a German officer reportedly discovers a chocolate cake from Boston in a captured American position and declares that the war is lost because the Americans can fly fresh cake across the Atlantic. It is a powerful image. It is also fiction. The line comes from the 1965 film Battle of the Bulge, spoken by the actor Robert Shaw, playing a fictional German colonel named Martin Hlur. It was written by a screenwriter. It never happened. I tell you this because getting the history right matters more than getting the drama right. The real evidence of the German reaction to American abundance is less cinematic than the movie version, but it is more important. The real evidence is Rinnet listing 3 factors and not listing a 4th. The real evidence is Manufel describing his supply system as already inadequate. The real evidence is papers men stealing American gasoline at gunpoint because the Reich could not fuel its own offensive. The real evidence is that by December 1944, the most experienced military professionals in Europe were launching an attack whose entire strategic logic depended on capturing the enemy's supplies because they no longer had their own. There is something the post-war German memoirs do not acknowledge. Something that the historians of the clean Wehrmacht myth have spent decades excavating. The German generals who wrote about American material superiority after the war were not just analyzing a military defeat. They were constructing an alibi. If Germany lost because the Americans had more trucks and more planes and more fuel, then Germany did not lose because its officers enabled a genocidal regime, because its soldiers committed systematic atrocities across Eastern Europe, or because its high command made catastrophic strategic decisions for which ideology was at least partly responsible. The material superiority argument was convenient. It allowed the German officer class to present itself as a group of brilliant professionals overwhelmed by brute force rather than as participants in a system that was rotten at its foundation. This matters for our story because it means the German testimony about American logistics, while real, is colored by the need to make American abundance the explanation for everything. The truth is more complicated. American abundance was real. American morale infrastructure was real. But the reason the morale infrastructure worked was not simply that America had more trucks. It was that America used some of those trucks for something the Germans never thought of. The trucks carried a message, and the message was, "You matter." On May 23, 2012, the United States Senate passed Resolution 471 commending the women of the American Red Cross mobiles for exemplary service during the Second World War. Senator Susan Collins, sponsoring the resolution, said, "A visit from a club was one of the most significant events for a young GI in combat far from home." It took 67 years for the Senate to say it. The women who had driven those trucks through Normandy and the Ardennes and across the Rhine, the ones who were still alive in 2012, were in their late 80s and 90s by then. Many had never spoken publicly about what they had done. Many had tucked their diaries and their photographs into drawers and gotten on with the business of living, the way veterans of every war do when the war recedes, and the country that asked them to serve moves on to the next thing. Liz Richardson is still at Normandy. Plot A, row 21, grave 5. She is 27 years old forever. She will never be older than the war that killed her. Her grave is in the same cemetery as the men who stormed the beaches she served behind. The men who lined up in the mud for a donut and a joke and 5 minutes of feeling like they had not been forgotten. She lies among them because she was one of them in every way except the rifle. The question that opened this investigation was why German generals could not believe that American donut trucks followed the front line. The answer is that they could not believe it because believing it would have required them to understand something about war that their entire tradition had not prepared them for. The Wehrmacht understood firepower. It understood maneuver. It understood supply, at least until it ran out of things to supply. It understood the mechanics of killing and the mechanics of movement. What it did not understand was the mechanics of caring. The German military tradition, for all its brilliance, was built on a fundamental assumption about the relationship between a state and its soldiers. The assumption was that the soldier existed to serve the state. His purpose was the mission. His value was his utility. His morale was to be sustained through ideology, through discipline, through the belief that he was fighting for something greater than himself. The American military tradition, which was younger and messier and far less theoretically sophisticated, was built on a different assumption. It assumed that the state existed to serve the soldier. Not perfectly, not without hypocrisy, not without the grotesque contradictions of racial segregation and institutional callousness, but at its foundation, the American system rested on the idea that the young man in the foxhole had been sent there by a democracy, and that the democracy owed him something in return. It owed him not just equipment and training and leadership, but the acknowledgement that he was a citizen before he was a soldier, and that his comfort, his dignity, and his connection to home were not luxuries to be dispensed with when the budget got tight. They were obligations. The American military in the Second World War, for all its flaws, for all its bureaucracy and waste and racial segregation and imperfection, understood one thing that the Wehrmacht did not. It understood that the man in the foxhole is not a component. He is not a mechanism. He is not an instrument of the state. He is a 19-year-old kid from Indiana or Alabama or New Jersey who has not slept in 3 days and who has watched his friends die and who is being asked to stand up tomorrow morning and do it again. And whether he stands up or whether he breaks is sometimes decided by things that have nothing to do with training or equipment or doctrine. It is decided by whether anyone in the vast machinery behind him has remembered that he is a human being. The donut was never about the donut. It was about the hand that gave it to him. It was about the woman from home who looked him in the eye and said, "Hi, soldier. What is cooking?" and meant it. It was about the fact that his country had spent fuel and shipping tonnage and human lives to get that donut to him. Not because a donut wins battles, but because the man who eats the donut does. The women who drove those trucks, who died in plane crashes and served under shellfire and never once picked up a weapon, understood what Helen Purviance had understood on her knees in a flooded tent in France in 1917, which is that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a man who is being asked to die for his country is to remind him that his country knows he is alive. Field Marshal Rundstedt listed 3 reasons for Germany's defeat: air superiority, fuel, railways. He was not wrong about any of them, but he missed the 4th reason, the one that was parked at every crossroads and every field hospital and every ammunition dump, the one that was driven by women who had volunteered to follow an army into a war because they believed it mattered. He missed the truck. And because he missed the truck, he missed the war. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of women like Helen Purviance and Liz Richardson and Dorothy Burge visible a little longer. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They went anyway, and the men they served never forgot them, even when the rest of the world did. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many stories like this one. Most of them are about ordinary people who decided that someone had to do something and that the someone was going to be